Morning, family. Yeah, I guess it is evening, isn't it? Thanks for pointing out the flaw, Keith. Sure. um, I'm gonna let you guys know I won't be here for the next couple of days. I got a friend who's doing a funeral down in Arkansas, so I'm gonna drive down there to kind of help him, and I will be back Saturday. So I'll be here for the Christmas thing Saturday night. But if any of you guys were planning on visiting with me or meeting with me on Friday, I will not be here. Tonight, we're going to go over Mark chapter 5. To me, it's really easy to go through Mark chapter 5 and try to treat it like three separate chapters almost, where you separate each story and make it its own thing. What I would like to do this evening, if we can get all the way through the chapter, which I know is a tall order, but I'm going to try, is kind of show how it ties itself together. The entire chapter really has an underlying message for us to receive. So hopefully we can make that goal tonight. That being said, a fulfilling Bible study is more important than how much we get done. So don't hesitate to speak up or ask questions if you've got them. Starting in verse 1, Mark writes, "They came to the other side of the sea, to the country of the Gerasenes." So if you weren't here last week, Mark chapter 4 ends with the calming of the storm. And so this is after they've gone through that and gotten to the other side. Verse 2, "And when Jesus had stepped out of the boat, immediately there met him out of the tombs a man with an unclean spirit. He lived among the tombs, and no one could bind him anymore, not even with a chain. For he had often been bound with shackles and chains, but he wrenched the chains apart and he broke the shackles in pieces. No one had the strength to subdue him. Night and day among the tombs and the mountains, he was always crying out and cutting himself with stones. And when he saw Jesus from afar, he ran and fell down before him, and crying out with a loud voice, he said, 'What have you to do with me, Jesus, Son of the Most High God? I adjure you by God, do not torment me.' For he was saying to him, 'Come out of the man, you unclean spirit.' And Jesus asked him, 'What is your name?' He replied, 'My name is Legion, for we are many.' And he begged him earnestly not to send them out of the country. Now a great herd of pigs was feeding there on the hillside, and they begged him, saying, 'Send us to the pigs, let us enter them.' So he gave them permission, and the unclean spirits came out and entered the pigs, and the herd, numbering about 2,000, rushed down the steep bank into the sea and drowned in the sea." Now, there's just, a few points here. So really, there's not very many stories that we have biblically of somebody being possessed by more than one spirit. The two that I know of comes from Mark chapter 5 and then the story of Mary Magdalene, who had 7. That's right. Other than that, most of the stories we have, spirit is always used in a singular form. Now, I don't know that necessarily there's any deep theological reason for this. I don't know that there's some deeper message we need to pull from this. But suffice it to say that the idea that we're supposed to get is the extreme torment that this man is going through. The point that we're going to get to is looking at Jesus' response to the situation. So if you recall last week, I had mentioned how I don't think Jesus planned out every encounter of his life. Right? We know that the Son of God is let's see if I can ruffle some feathers tonight. Jesus himself is not omniscient. He is not all-knowing like the Father is. Now, my argument for that is that he specifically tells us that there are things he doesn't know. Off the top of my head, one of those being like when he's going to return. He specifically tells us only the Father knows that. And I think that if we're looking at his life story, we're also seeing things like that. Now we're going to get to the last story of chapter 5, and we're going to be looking at this woman with a blood issue. And this is kind of one of those stories that always brings up the question of whether Jesus was all-knowing or not. But I want you to keep that idea in mind going into the story, that we're already told that he doesn't know everything. So, with that in mind, we'll keep moving on. Verse 14, the herdsman fled and told it in the city and in the country, and people came to see what it was that had happened. And they came to Jesus and saw the demon-possessed man, the one who had the legion, sitting there, clothed and in his right mind, and they were afraid. And those who had seen it described to them what had happened to their demon-possessed man and to the pigs. And they began to beg Jesus to depart from the region. As he was getting into the boat, the man who had been possessed with demons begged him that he might be with him. And he did not permit him, but said to him, "Go home to your friends, tell them how much the Lord has done for you, and how he has had mercy on you." And he went away and began to proclaim in the Decapolis how much Jesus had done for him, and everyone marveled. So I do think that there's something worth saying about Jesus not allowing the man to follow him. There are people that Jesus specifically says, "You're supposed to come and follow me and learn from me," right? And then there are men like this gentleman who he forbids to follow him and says, "You need to go and tell people about this." Church history has a period of celebrating men who decided to remove themselves from the world in order to study God's word and to serve God. Right? And we're talking about monastic people who become monks and live in monasteries, nuns, things like that. If we study through the life of Luther, right, which is kind of he's kind of the forefather of the sorry, I'm having a hard time coming up with the word. Protestant movement, the revival of the church, right, where we separated from the Catholic Church and separated ourselves from a state-ran church. Luther kind of started all of that with his 99 Thesis, and he was big on confronting corruption within the church and improper teachings and things like that. And one of the things that Luther has described later on in life is that he came to realize that his living at a monastery, because Luther was a Catholic monk, he lived in a monastery completely separated from the world. And one of the things that he said he began to realize is that there's no authority in the scriptures that allow us to remove ourselves from the world that we were born into. That the idea that I can remove myself from life and go live in a monastery and live for God in that situation is wholly unscriptural, because the idea of the gospel is that we're supposed to be living this fealty, this loyalty to God out where other people can see it. And we're supposed to be telling people what God can do for us. And you can't do that in isolationism. I think that this ties into what's happened with this man here. Jesus has denied him to come follow him, but he doesn't just say, "You can't be with me." He charges him. He tells him it's your purpose, your job, your duty to go out and tell people what the Lord's done for you. And I think that call is still a call for us today. We're still under the same obligation to go out and tell people what the Lord has done for us. That hasn't changed over the course of thousands of years. That's still the desire of God, right? So, The other point that I wish to make is the reaction that people have to what Jesus does, right? You look at pretty much everybody, almost everybody that we read through that Jesus saves in some way, and they have almost the same reaction. They want to be with him. They want to follow him. They want to commit to him. And sometimes he allows it. Sometimes he allows it for a time. Sometimes he, like this man, he says no. But I think it's an interesting thing to note how many people will say that they know who Jesus is and that they acknowledge what Jesus has done for them and they love what Jesus has done for him. But there's no pursuit left. You know? I can acknowledge Jesus Christ as my Savior, but that's kind of where it ends for a lot of people. There has to be a pursuit after that, where you're pursuing the Master, you're pursuing the person that you're trying to look like, that you're trying to emulate from. And that pursuit, the level of that pursuit, directly coincides with our own commitment to the gospel plan. Does that make sense? And what I'm saying making sense to everybody? Okay. So in verse 21, and keep in mind, Mark moves really fast. We don't actually know how much time passes between these stories. But I do think there's a reason that Mark puts them in the order that they're in and why he doesn't focus on the passage of time. Verse 21, and when Jesus had crossed again in the boat to the other side, because remember that these people told him they wanted him to leave, a great crowd gathered about him, and he was beside the sea. Then came one of the rulers of the synagogue, Jairus by name, and seeing him, he fell at his feet and implored him earnestly, saying, "My little daughter is at the point of death. Come and lay your hands on her, so that she may be made well and live." And he went with him. So we already have two very different reactions to the evidence of Jesus Christ's miraculous works, right? Now, obviously, we have the Pharisees and Sadducees who focus on the legalistic side of things. But just here, we have everyday people responding very differently to the character of Christ. Right? You have people who become afraid of the power that he wields and wish to chase him off, which has just happened in the first segment. And then you have this reaction where people are coming to him and begging to be a part of it, begging him to bless them with these miracles and these healings. And I think that if we're presenting a working Christ, right, a living Christ, a Christ that still does work today, right, which is what we should be proclaiming, because salvation is not a passive thing. Jesus Christ actively saves us constantly. And so, and he actively advocates for us constantly. So, if we're proclaiming this action-oriented Christ, this living Christ, then we're going to have much the same reactions. We're going to have people that want to chase that away from them and want to be separated from it as far as possible for a multitude of reasons, and the least of which is there are still people that are afraid of the kind of power that we're declaring. And that seems really foolish, but to be honest, I read this story and I think those people seem pretty foolish too. But there are legitimately, you're talking about a man who's capable of resurrecting the dead and fighting every spiritual battle with no chance of loss. There is great power in what we talk about, in what we're following. And there are going to be a lot of people that are really uncomfortable with the idea of somebody having that kind of power. And I think, go ahead, Sam.
I'm wondering about the people that asked him to leave. I mean, he had just cost them financially a fortune.
Some of them.
1,000 pigs.
Some of them. Yeah, the herdsmen definitely.
Yeah.
Whoever
owned those pigs was out a lot of money.
Absolutely.
And if you saw that the guy had even just the power to do that, it might be time to say, would you please move along the road?
Yeah. Yeah, good point. Go ahead, Dave.
obviously they're probably not Jewish people,
Right.
maybe of Gentile persuasion.
Mm-hmm.
I know that area, we don't know if the demon-possessed guy is Jewish.
No, we don't.
The area was predominantly Gentile.
Yes.
And they probably had a different concept of God or than the Jewish people. That might be the difference of, hey, I don't get who am I.
Yeah.
I'm really afraid of that. I don't understand. Whereas the Jewish people, they get stories of God working.
Mm-hmm.
Splitting the Red Sea and how God works in their lives. That may be the perception.
I agree that there's definitely something to be said for cultural differences, and if you think about it today, who's easier to preach to? People who grew up knowing about God, or people who know nothing about God? You know, you're going to get different reactions from the two groups. But I will go back to in this passage. You're right. The herdsmen lost a lot of money, but we're not even told that it was just the herdsmen. We're told that the people came and saw this and were instantly afraid. This isn't there's probably a lot to do with that, but this isn't a matter of I'm angry, you've costed me money. I'm afraid of what you're capable of.
Look at the circumstances. Here's a guy. He's running around screaming at night.
Mm-hmm.
You get the thought process that people just want this guy's not moving around.
Yeah, they shackled him up in a cave.
I hope we'll just use the name Fred. I hope Fred is that guy.
Yeah.
And which he was. He actually saw all the things about him. And then right behind
Yeah.
how are we gonna react?
Sure.
Really?
Sure. But that goes to my point. We're still preaching the same Jesus. We're still preaching that same visible action. And you know, as I've preached several times, and I've heard Rudy preach quite a few times, people should be able to see evidence of that working, right? People should be able to tell that there is something wholly unique about whatever's going on in my life that allows me to live in the way that I'm living. And when I start talking to people about the concept of putting yourself to death and being resurrected, right, on faith, you know, burying yourself in water, I mean, those are pretty scary concepts from a worldly standpoint. You know, I mean, we're talking about killing yourself. And sometimes we gloss over that, I think, because we hear it so many times and because it's not a finality and because of the way that we preach it. I think sometimes we gloss over that, but that's really what we're advertising. There's an opportunity for you to die and be someone else. And I think that we're going to find that people react in a lot of the similar ways. That's a terrifying concept to a lot of people. You know, you look at the rise of pagan religions within the last, it started in the 70s, but it's really grown to prominence within the last 15 years or so. Wicca is one of those, Asatru, Druidism, shamanism. I mean, there's quite a few of them, actually. But you look at the rise of pagan religions, one of the underlying messages that all of these religions teach is self-empowerment. Well, that stands in stark contrast to what we're preaching. Because I don't preach that you have power. I preach that you lack any power. And I'm advertising that there's somebody you should submit to who has that power. And you need to submit to his authority and you need to submit to his, but that is in stark contrast to the self-empowerment religions that so many people have chosen to follow over the last couple of decades. And those people, oftentimes when you preach to them, they respond in a very similar way. They become angry and fearful, and they want you to leave. They'll say horrible, nasty things about you, make things up. They don't even know you. But it's just for the sake of what you're preaching requires a complete change in how I see the world. But then you're going to have somebody like Jairus who sees or hears stories of these workings, and he wants that for himself, and he's going to go seek that out. Now, we're going to get into how desperate this man is. You know, for sure, Jesus was not his first stop in seeking help. But you're going to have similar people like that today. There are going to be people who, when you start talking about this idea of, you know, there is hope for something better than this, and you talk about, I'm giving you the ability to die and to be resurrected as somebody completely different. There are people that really speaks to. There are going to be people that really want that for themselves. And so we have to be prepared. All I'm saying in all of this is that we have to be prepared for both reactions. And you can't be shocked when you get one or the other, because those two reactions have existed ever since Jesus began his ministry. So we're looking at Jairus, and he says, my little daughter is at the point of death. Come and lay your hands on her so that she may be made well and live. And he went with him, and a great crowd followed him and thronged about him. And there was a woman who had a discharge of blood for 12 years, right? This is the woman with the blood issue that I told you we were going to get to. 26, and who had suffered much under many physicians, and had spent all that she had, and was no better, but rather grew worse. She had heard the reports about Jesus, and came up behind him in the crowd and touched his garment, for she said, if I touch even his garments, I will be made well. And immediately the flow of blood dried up, and she felt in her body that she was healed of her disease. And Jesus, perceiving in himself that power had gone out from him, immediately turned about in the crowd and said, who touched my garments? And his disciples said to him, you see the crowd pressing around you, and yet you say, who touched me? And he looked around to see who had done it. But the woman, knowing what had happened to her, came in fear and trembling, and fell down before him, and told him the whole truth. And he said to her, daughter, your faith has made you well. Go in peace and be healed of your disease. So, and after this, we're going to get back to the story of Jairus, but we're taking a detour to talk about this woman who's perceived an opportunity and jumped on it. Now, a few things about this woman. A, we're not going to spend time contemplating what this disease is. We don't know. We don't know anything about it other than there was blood issues and she was bleeding. There's a lot of people who've tried to make statements that, you know, this was a menstruation that never ended. There's people that believe there might have been an open wound that wouldn't close. We don't know. We have no idea. All we know is she bled regularly for 12 years. Okay. What I do know is that this is the passage a lot of people go to start discussing or to open up dialogue about the omnipotence and the omniscience of Jesus Christ. And the reason for that is because he asked the question, who touched me? And so they argue, well, that means that he doesn't know everything. Well, to be fair, I agree that Jesus himself told us, again, that he doesn't know everything. But this question, I don't know that it necessarily lends to that concept. If you think back to when you were a kid and you did something you weren't supposed to, how many of you had parents that asked you if you did it? Yeah?
Everybody's parents ask that.
Yeah, right? When I was little, I was hitting golf balls around in my grandparents' backyards, broke out one of his garage windows. And he came out, saw the broken window, saw me with a golf club, said, did you break my window? Well, of course I broke the window. Of course you know that I broke the window. There's a golf ball on the other side of the window. right? But why does he do that?
You have to admit it.
It gives you an opportunity to speak up. And for me, I read this story, and that's at least what it seems like Jesus is doing. It's not that he doesn't know who's doing it, or that he couldn't figure it out very quickly at the very least, but more that he wants the person to come forward and open up about it. Second, the omnipotence, which it just means all powerful for those of you that don't necessarily like those words. The argument is, well, he felt power going out of him, and so that means he can't be all powerful. Well, again, I'm not limited on how much breath I can breathe, right? I can breathe as much as I want to. I still know when it leaves my body. Now, that's not a perfect analogy, but the point is just because Jesus has a never-ending supply of power doesn't mean he doesn't understand when that power has been used by something. So, my point in all of this is I don't think that this passage is a good place to go for discussing either of those issues. Go ahead, Dave.
Because we have other passages where Jesus is talking about knowing what was in their heart.
Mhm.
Scribes are thinking something in their brain, and he's saying, why do you think that this is happening?
Yeah.
He's understanding what the thing is saying, but obviously, in those instances, he was.
Omniscient. Yeah. Yeah.
Present all the time.
Yeah. Yeah, and there's definitely a great dialogue to be had on the subject. I and we'll hopefully sometime take a look at all those passages and really discuss it. But my main point tonight is this is not a chapter to go to. So in the other part of this is, and the reason I'm spending so much time on some of what you probably think are weird points is because there's a lot of things taught about Mark chapter 5 that don't have good foundation. And for me as a teacher, I believe that one of my responsibilities is to make sure that you're aware of some of the teachings that are out there and why they don't hold water. So that's why I'm going through some of this stuff. I hope that you don't see that as a complete waste of your time. I hope that you find it interesting. But the idea is to equip you to knowing the scriptures a little bit better. And also being able to identify wrong or at the very least incorrect teachings when you hear them. So one of these other things is this idea that the woman was bleeding for 12 years. And so people have connected that 12 years with Jairus and his daughter, and some have gotten to the conclusion that this woman is Jairus' daughter's mother. There are so many leaps in that argument that it's ridiculous. It's as Sam just made a point of, laughable. So yes, there's some really cool connections when we read scriptures. But don't make the mistake of jumping to a set conclusion about things. I'm not sure why Mark decided that the number of years she bled was important enough for us to know. Suffice it to say that it's there, but we don't want to be making improper connections with it. So the other point is that I wanted to draw your attention to about this particular story is verse 26, and who had suffered much under many physicians and had spent all that she had and was no better, but rather grew. How many of you guys have read on or studied doctor treatments in history? Yeah. Barbaric would be a nice word. It wasn't that long ago we were still leeching people. Barbers got their red and white poles because a barber shop used to be a place where you could go to get bloodletted if you were sick. The fact is, medical history is filled with people who are supposedly some of the most learned people in society doing horrible things to people with absolutely no logical reason for it. During the period of the Roman Empire, which is what we're looking at, physicians were basically less knowledgeable priests who experimented. The idea of, well, I'm going to try this and pray to some god and maybe it'll work. And when that didn't work, they'd try something else and they'd try something else, right? Everyone was basically a large experiment. And in essence, if you got healed during one of those experiments, I automatically assume it was the experiment that worked rather than maybe you just got better. So during this time, they still bloodletted. Believe it or not, that practice has been around for a huge portion of human history. The idea that I can cut open a vein and let bad stuff out. We don't worry about the fact that I'm also letting, blood out. Some of the other treatments, they would actually gas people. They would make an incense of noxious herbs and actually force people to breathe that in and make them sick. And my point in throwing all of this out there is I want you to understand the mindset that this woman is in and the amount of duress that she's been under and the distress that she's feeling over her situation and also the hopelessness. It takes something to go to a physician. At this time, it took something to go to a physician in the first place. I would argue that it still does. But yet this woman went to several physicians over the course of 12 years, and it talks about she suffered under those physicians. But she's pretty much out of options at that point. Sometimes people are much the same way in that they are only going to hear or seek out power of Christ when they're at a point of complete hopelessness.
Desperation.
Yeah. Hope only looks good when you realize how little you have.
That's exactly the reason I can.
Yeah. There's a great many people with, that tells their story. When you realize that there's no hope anywhere else, there's nowhere else to turn. So, go ahead.
She must have, she heard about Jesus, right?
Mm-hmm.
What he was doing. She thought in her mind, I kind of touch Jesus' clothes. I'll be.
Mm-hmm. I think that's a good point to make, and in fact, if you think back to most of the stories of people being healed, Jesus usually attributes it to their faith. And we have the same message in today's gospel, right? Grace through faith. But while grace is what saves us, we acquire that through our faith. And people during this time were acquiring healing of Christ through faith. The healing was there. The faith was the same. It just looks a little bit different. But yeah, that's an excellent point because, she could have stopped him. She could have asked to talk to him. She could have begged him. But she had decided that it would be enough if she just touched a piece of cloth that he owned. I think that also, alongside faith, I think it also speaks to humility. That she felt that was adequate for her. There's some times where we get so in our own minds and in our own suffering that we think we need more than what's actually offered. it would have been easy to say, well, yeah, but I've had this problem for 12 years. This is way more serious than just touching a cloak. You know, I need him to heal me.
Well, it's like, you know, he had hundreds of people on the who touched me? Wow, they're all touched. They weren't touched. I would think.
Yeah. Yeah. Go ahead, Dave.
God just came to you, and said that she had humility. What's happening before that? Here's a synagogue, remember the synagogue official? Yeah, synagogue official named Jairus,
Mm-hmm.
got high standing in society, comes to Jesus and says, hey, daughter's dying, come to my house. Chance that I got now,
Yeah. My daughter's dying. You're over here worrying about a little bit of blood. Yeah. Now and since you brought up that he was a ruler of the synagogue, I want to point something else out to you. Where was synagogues generally found? Center of every city where there was a presence of Jews, right? Yep. So I think that I think that I'm not crossing any lines by saying we can assume that there were at least some people in this crowd who were Jewish.
I've always assumed that this was a Jewish city, and basically this was Jesus is walking with the President of the United States, and
Yeah.
someone's going to walk up and interrupt him?
Yeah. I generally assume the same thing, but I want to be careful not to teach that that's the case.
Yeah, I agree.
Because we don't know how many Jews there were, but we know that there were Jews. There was enough to need a synagogue. Now, the point I would make is the Old Testament is very clear on what makes a person clean or unclean, right? And so, pop quiz for you: would this woman be considered clean or unclean under the old law? Unclean. Now, one of the things about the old law is if you touch somebody who was unclean, what did that make you? So how do you, and what did an unclean person have to do?
Well, you have to go through ritual society. First one was leave the camp.
Yep.
Spend 5 to 7 days somewhere else.
Yeah. So how would you feel if you found out that some random woman in the crowd had been unclean this whole time and has been bustling around and bumping into people, and you have no idea if she touched you or not? You think maybe there was a couple different reasons why she was coming forward in fear and trembling?
Yeah. I've never considered that.
So we'll move on with this particular story, right? In verse 35, and just to validate Keith further, verse 34 says, "Your faith has made you well. Go in peace." Right? But verse 35, while he was still speaking, there came from the ruler's house some who said, "Your daughter is dead. Why trouble the teacher any further?" But overhearing what they said, Jesus said to the ruler of the synagogue, "Do not fear, only believe." And he allowed no one to follow him except Peter and James and John, the brother of James. They came to the house of the ruler of the synagogue, and Jesus saw a commotion, people weeping and wailing loudly. And when he had entered, he said to them, "Why are you making a commotion and weeping? The child is not dead, but sleeping." And they laughed at him, but he put them all outside and took the child's father and mother and those who were with him and went in where the child was. Taking her by the hand, he said to her, "Talitha cumi," which means, "Little girl, I say to you, arise." And immediately the girl got up and began walking, for she was 12 years of age. And they were immediately overcome with amazement, and he strictly charged them that no one should know this, and told them to give her something to eat. So, as I already pointed out, people have made the improper connection between the woman having this issue for 12 years and her being 12 years old. I would also point out that the passage specifically says her mother was present at this, right? But anyways, with this story of Jairus, and you'll probably hear this from me again pretty soon as we talk about discipleship, but we're in the chapter, so we're going to talk about it anyways. How many disciples does Jesus have?
12 direct plus a group of,
Sure. But 12 that we generally consider to be with Jesus pretty much all the time, right? How many were allowed to witness this?
3. No order of company except Peter, James, and John. Yeah,
Mhm.
3.
So, and we'll, like I said, we'll have a whole lesson on this, but when we look at Jesus and his discipling of his disciples, if that makes sense, we have this idea of continually decreasing circles. Okay, and so on the outside circle, this big circle around him, you have everyone who came to him, and the people who followed him to hear what he was teaching and to ask for miracles, right? And then in a slightly smaller circle, you have the people who followed him profusely, his disciples, the women who supported his ministry, those kinds of things. In a slightly smaller circle, you have the 12. But then you have an even smaller circle with Peter, James, and John. There, I have a hard time with the idea of clique-like behavior in the church. Not that I have an issue necessarily with you having a group. I more have an issue with people who don't understand why that's actually somewhat beneficial or can be beneficial. And so I want to address this really quick. Even Jesus had a group of people that he let in on a deeper level than other people. And most of you are going to experience that in some way, even within our church, right? You can come and you worship with all of us, and you surely feel some kind of brotherly affection towards each of us. But you're going to have a select group of people that you're closer to, and you do things with, and you call them, and you talk to them, and you open up about things you wouldn't necessarily talk to the whole congregation about. And then within that, you're going to have an even smaller group of people who you trust. People you believe you can count on. People that you would call when you're having a hard time or need help. We're going to see this behavior reflected in our own lives. I think it's natural for us to get to that state. However, and this is a big point to make, when you're in your group, you cannot be exclusive. Right? There's a huge difference between saying I have my group of people that I surround myself with, that I know, that I trust, that I get along with, that I really feel close to. And then there's, I'm going to exclude anyone not in this group. We cannot do that. That is not our place. That is not a Christ-like example. Christ had his people, but he didn't tell people, you can't come hear what I have to say. He didn't tell people you can't follow me, with exception. But the vast majority of people, he doesn't say, don't follow me, don't come listen to me, you go that way. Right? Most of them, he was content to let them come and they'd hear what he had to say, and he'd include them in what they wanted to be included in. So when we're going about our business in church, it's perfectly fine that you have a select group of people that you feel closer to than others. Maybe somebody you consider a really, really close friend. But don't exclude the entire congregation from your life for the sake of the few people. Does that point make sense, what I'm trying to say there? The last point we'll make tonight, the last point we'll make about this particular passage tonight is that Jesus at this point tells them that no one is allowed to know what he's done. Which I think is why he told them she's not dead, she's sleeping. Is because there's now viable excuse for how she's alive to all the people that weren't witnesses to it. But my question that I want to ask you is why did Jesus decide that no one was allowed to know of this?
Time. Ecclesiastes 3. Time for every season. It wasn't the time for this one. Some of the other things it was, but for this was not. Might have been the city, might have been the people, who knows?
I think that, and I think you're right, Sam. I agree that Jesus makes it pretty clear at times in his ministry. This is not the time for people to see this from me. This is, even tells his mother that at the wedding, right? But I read into it a little bit, and for me, it kind of makes me think of the idea of sometimes we just need to do good things without everybody knowing about it. Sometimes it's good to just do something good without having everybody know we're doing it. My take on it, for what it's worth. So the last point I want to make about the chapter as a whole, right? The wrapping up of this chapter. I know we're going a little bit over time, but bear with me if you will. How long did each of these stories take?
It took exactly as long as it took.
Yeah, in short, we don't actually know, but let's just make a guess. Based on the details we have, how long do you think it might have taken Jesus to walk into that building and tell a little girl to get up? Minutes. How long do you think it might have taken a woman to come forward and tell Jesus that she had been healed by touching his garments? Moments. Just judging from what we read in the passages, how long do you think it took for the man who has been made clean to come to his senses and for other people to come running and witness it?
Well, when you start taking to the end, when they're coming and chasing him off,
Mhm.
what are we talking hours?
Sure. So what have we, who's good at math? What have we added up here? Couple of hours couple of hours. I think that most people, and understand this is all conjecture. We don't actually know how long each story took. There was time in between the stories. I get that. But just bear with the point. Most of us severely underestimate how much we're capable of in a day. Most of us severely underestimate how many good works can be fit into a 24-hour period. We don't have to go looking for them. That's the amazing thing about all this. The awesome thing about having a God who set aside good works specifically for us is that we don't really have to go looking for good works. We just have to have our eyes open. Right? Jesus Christ does not, at least from appearances, plan his day around making sure that he met these appointments. But rather, at least from my, this side of heaven's vision, it seems to me that opportunities came up and Jesus simply allowed God to work in that given situation. And that's all good works is. That's all God really expects from you. But there's so often that we talk about how busy we are, and don't get me wrong. Sometimes we are just too busy. Sometimes there's just too much. But I think that as God's people, we need to be careful about using that. Because excuses have this impact on us. where it allows us to excuse ourselves multiple times, even though we only used it once. You think about like coming to church, right? And the first time you tell yourself, I had to work late last night, and I'm just too tired. I'd probably fall asleep anyways if I went, so I'm just gonna stay home and get my rest. How easy is it the next week to say, I'm still really tired. I think I'm gonna stay home and get some rest. I'll watch it. I'll watch the recording. The thing is, the more we give ourselves those excuses, those outs, the more we can say, I'm too busy, or I'm too tired, or I have too much. The more we do that, the easier it becomes to do that more often. The easiest way to make sure that you're attending church as frequently as possible is to never let yourself have an excuse to not attend church. Because the second you start allowing yourself to come up with those excuses, they're never going to stop. And the same goes with helping people or good works, if you will, if you want to put it in that phrasing. When we're looking at helping people out, doing good things for others, the more we give ourselves an excuse for why I can't do that, the easier it is to always have an excuse for why that shouldn't be me. Now, all that being said, absolutely be aware of what's going on in your life. Know when you've reached your limit. Know when you really have hit that point where I cannot give this due credit. Because if you just say yes all the time, you will get to that point, and then you're letting everyone down anyways, because you're not going to be able to do it to your best of your abilities. Okay? But be careful not to just simply start allowing yourself excuses. If you can tell yourself, well, I helped out so-and-so 2 days ago. If that's your excuse for why you're too busy and can't help somebody out, there's a problem. Because that didn't take 2 days to do it. There's 24 hours in front of you right now. My point in all of this, don't underestimate how much good work you can do for the kingdom in that period of time. That's all I've got tonight. Do we have anyone want to make some lasting comments or words of wisdom that are more impactful than mine? All right. Let's join in prayer. Dear God, ruler of creation and Father of our souls, we thank you so much for the blessings of this day. We thank you for the blessings of each person's presence here tonight. We thank you for the presence of your word in our lives. Thank you for the Holy Spirit that resides within us. Come before you tonight to ask that you help us to stay motivated. Help us to keep our eyes open. Help us to keep our hearts open so that we can see those opportunities when you place them before us, and that we can have the patience and humility and faith to stop and allow you to work in those moments. Lord, we ask that you use us. You've placed us here. You've redeemed us. You've called us your own. So use us. Let us be servants of your kingdom. Give us a purpose each day. And as each person leaves this fellowshipping tonight, I ask that you protect each one of them, that you get them home safely, that you watch over them in the struggles of their life, and that you help each of us to be more aware of those we call brothers and sisters. And we ask that you help us to be who they need us to be, who you would have us be. So that as we continue in learning and studying together, we can continue in unity, in love and affection for one another, so that we can show ever brighter the glory and the grace that you have provided to us to the rest of the world. We ask and pray these things in the name of your Son, Jesus, our Christ, Lord and Savior. Amen.
Aye.